King Alcinous makes good on his promise and sends Odysseus back to Ithaca. Odysseus sleeps the whole way home, and the Phaeacians lay a sleeping Odysseus on the beach and leave. Poseidon, meanwhile, convinces Zeus to punish the Phaeacians for their hospitality in aid of Odysseus. Back in Ithaca, Odysseus awakes and fears he's been hoodwinked by the Phaeacians and must now suffer yet another unknown island. Athena, under the guise of a shepherd boy, tells Odysseus he's on Ithaca, and he spins for her some grand tale regarding his background. Athena reveals herself, and she and Odysseus enjoy a warm conversation about her role in bringing him back to his home. She helps him hide his treasure in a cave, and then they sit to plot the death of the suitors. The book ends with Athena telling Odysseus to go to his loyal servant, the swineherd, and she leaves for Sparta to call Telemachus home.
Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. I'm Adam Minihan, and we're so glad you are here. Whether you are wondering why Odysseus is already back home and we're only halfway through the book, whether you enjoy a charming conversation between a goddess and man, or whether you're like me and really appreciate a loyal man like the swineherd, we are glad you're here listening to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. Make sure you go check us out on social media so that way you can share with us all of the conversations that you guys have been having as we've made our way through Homer in a year. We're what, I guess, 3/4 of the way there. So It's great to have you guys on the journey. As always, I have my good friend Deacon Harrison Garlick with me. Deacon, it has been a lot of fun. I haven't been on the last couple episodes, I think, so it's good to be back. Thanks for allowing me to be back on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Welcome to your own podcast. That's good.
And we have a great guest. I'll let you introduce him.
Yes, today we are very happy to have Pavlos Papadopoulos, right? Papadopoulos, did I pronounce that right?
That's right.
Good, very good. Who serves as the Assistant Professor of Humanities at the Wyoming Catholic College. So, Professor, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation and the hospitality.
Yeah, so I was on Twitter or X or whatever it is the other day, and I saw pictures being shared from Wyoming Catholic College, which, if I understood correctly, was a Eucharistic procession through a field with people on horseback surrounding the Blessed Sacrament. So that kind of leads me to a question. What is Wyoming Catholic College?
Wyoming Catholic College is a college that is Catholic and in Wyoming. And I guess the images you saw of our procession from All Saints Day, from the parish down through the hayfield in front of the parish, through town to our dorm of All Saints, is a fitting emblem of that. We are a 4-year, all required, all integrated great books program where our students read the classics from Homer and Plato and Aristotle onwards to the 20th century, study those texts through the disciplines of humanities, theology, philosophy, and others. And yet we're not just studying the great books as one might in any location. We take our location in the foothills of the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming very seriously, and we're very intentional about being in the place we are and allowing that to form and inform our approach to education. So we have a substantial outdoor component to our education. All of our students do a 21-day backpacking trip as part of their freshman year to begin their freshman year. It's the longest and most intense freshman orientation, I think, in existence at a college in the United States. And then they regularly return to the outdoors as part of their education. There's also a horsemanship element, as was on display in that procession. Our students take a semester of horsemanship, and we understand all of this, the sort of encounter with the wilderness, with God's first book out in the mountains and in the deserts, as well as the encounter with and learning to be a leader over a horse as an integral part of a liberal education, not just a wonderful thing you might do on the weekend, but something that ought to be part of the formation of a whole person. So we try to educate our students as the full persons they are, body, soul, and spirit. And therefore, we are similar to other institutions in our reverence for and use of the great books in the classroom, but we want to educate those other parts of the human person as well, and that includes the body. It includes sort of the capacity for wonder at nature and those other elements.
That's beautiful.
Very John Senior-esque.
Yeah, the horsemanship, I think, is a fascinating component. I grew up, so I'm from Oklahoma, right? We're broadcasting here from Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma my whole childhood. And my father was on the mounted patrol for the local sheriff department. And so I grew up with horses and grew up like in the horse barn and being around the sheriff and the police horses. And now my kids are also growing up around horses. And yeah, there's a certain level of like virtue building there that I think is incredibly unique, right? To actually learn how to take care of a horse and ride a horse and actually, control this animal. Is that anything that you were familiar with before you became a professor out there? If you become a professor at Wyoming Catholic College, do you also have to learn how to ride a horse? Like, how does that work?
It was not part of the interview process, for better or for worse. Maybe it should be. I was, however, and still in the position of being married to a great horsewoman. So my wife was very involved in horsemanship when we met, when we got married, and then she's in our time here, she's begun to teach in the program. So we're sort of a faculty spouses at this point, where I teach in the classroom and she teaches in the horsemanship arena. And they're wonderful complements to one another. Especially, I would think of it as that kind of leadership and moral formation and guidance of another ensouled being of a horse is a kind of analog to political leadership or leadership over other humans in a family. And my background is primarily in political philosophy, as well as the great books more widely. And so there's this wonderful complementarity between learning to ride and learning the art of horsemanship, and also studying politics and studying ethics and studying that kind of leadership as we do through the great books and through those disciplines.
I like that a lot. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously Plato makes the analog too, right? Of that horsemanship and being able to control components of your own soul, right? And control your passions and your spiritedness and things like this, right? No, I think that's a great analog. And that's one thing too, I think, with my own kids, trying to raise them to understand how to ride a horse is just like the natural virtue building that comes into that. It's amazing too. I mean, you can watch kids that are 8, 9 years old, take command of this animal and, and canter and jump and do things like this that just build so much confidence in them as well.
That's right. And it requires, I would say it requires a similar balance of humility and boldness as approaching the great books does. So you need to have a kind of humility before the animal as having its own drive, its own nature that you need to respect, and you can't just treat it like a bicycle or something like that, or a car. But at the same time, you need to have a certain confidence, a certain spiritedness, Plato might call it, in order to actually command respect and step into a role of true authority, not merely being a rider who sits up there and sort of gets bounced along, but also not acting like a tyrant to the horse. And there's something to be said for that in just all of human relations, in our relation to our fellow man, but also in relation to the books that we read. We want to be docile to them, and yet not wet towels. We also want to bring a kind of zeal and eagerness to question and to push and to prod the great text that we're attempting to learn from.
No, I think that's wonderful. Yeah, respect is such a key word there, right? About respecting the animal and that you are in charge. But then if the horse decides that you're not in charge, how quickly that can actually change, right? How quickly you find yourself on the ground. So just on a Sin, the Great Books podcast, we're working through this year of Homer. We've been talking a lot about why we even read Homer and why we even read the great books. I'm assuming this is a question that you take up often, right, at the college. So when you have that like freshman, right, now we've kind of gone through why do I have to learn horsemanship? If they say, well, why do I have to learn the great books? Like, what's the benefit here? Like, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I can speak. I often invoke my own experience in a college great books program and in a graduate school great books program, which is that the great authors, through the great books that they left behind, taught me not only some wonderful answers to important questions, but also how to ask those those questions in the first place. And so seeing those authors and the books that they've left as functioning as some of the best teachers that are available to us, and learning not only the things they have to say in terms of imperative statements but also in terms of interrogatives, learning how to be more fully a rational animal, learning more fully how to cultivate and act upon our reason, is greatly benefited by learning the kinds of questions, the kinds of disciplines that have been developed through the great authors, as well as the conclusions and arguments that they've given. I would say that a great book's education is a wonderful way to encounter some of the greatest teachers some of the greatest human teachers that have ever lived, through the books that they've left behind, and do so in a collaborative way that also is a kind of occasion for cultivating great friendships. If you are side by side with your classmates, trying to pick away at the same text or wonder at the beauty of something that you've read, there's a kind of camaraderie that's formed there that is difficult to form in other contexts.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I find, so Pavlos, this is the first time, just for your the listener's sake, this is the first time that I've read the Odyssey. First time I read through the Iliad. I was not a guy who had the opportunity, I guess, to read the great books, so I'm starting really late, but want to do it so that way I can pass it on to my children as well, right? And but I find, I think this is very, I think you hit it on the head. Like, I find that when I do this with other people, it quenches a thirst that I didn't even realize that I had, right? Like, as I'm going through and reading through these books together, maybe I'm reading it and it's a surface level read, and then all of a sudden this other guy who's read it for the second or third time, he brings out something that I didn't even consider, and then vice versa. And so, like, the camaraderie that is built upon reading great books, but then also like the insights that you're able to have whenever you read them together out loud, is invaluable. Like, it's something that I didn't even realize I needed until I started doing it.
That's right. And I would just add to that, the way I've just presented it and the way you've responded, this is something that's accessible to anyone at any time, in any place, in any context, right? As long as you have the book in front of you, it really helps to have some people around you to talk about it. And that's all true and accurate. I want to point out that that's probably also incomplete, that these are not just any old texts that happen to be really great at generating conversation. They are that. They're also part of a tradition that has formed us, whether or not we know it and whether or not we recognize it. So both for, you could say, a strictly traditional reason of wanting to become enculturated to the civilization that we are born into and that we have as a kind of birthright to be enculturated to, and also for maybe philosophical reasons or questiony reasons that if we want to examine the tradition, if we want to examine the civilization that we're born into, we better find as many grabbing on points to it as we can, and the great books are certainly prominent among those. What does it actually mean to be a member of Western civilization? Homer is going to have something to do with the answer to that, whether you like it or not. And so, for the sake of sparking the conversations that are relevant to the human condition in every time and place, and also for grappling with our own tradition, Homer and all of these other authors are wonderful places to go to.
Oh, very good. I think that's an excellent segue to probably actually looking at Homer himself and looking at the text. So we are on book 13. Fagles entitles this Ithaca at last, right? Because finally Odysseus has made it back to Ithaca. And I think that, Adam, as you mentioned earlier, which was something that struck me the first time I read this is, I don't know, my third or fourth read through, is that I was really surprised first time I read it that he's back so soon, right? I mean, it's a 24 book poem, and like he's already back basically halfway through the text. That's something that really surprised me. And we've kind of noted, his like 4 books of retelling his story, the King Alcinous, almost has all the stories in it that people know culturally from the Odyssey. They're all just like jam-packed into this like one section, right? Where you've got the Cyclops, you've got the Sirens, you have Calypso, you've got Scylla and Charybdis, right? Like all these narratives are kind of shoved into this. And then all of a sudden, like halfway through the text, he's home. And it's like him coming back. And I think that it's only now my maybe second or third read that I've started to really have more of an appreciation for these texts, and I think some of the subtleties that Homer brings to these. So let's kind of look at this. So we start off, and he is still with King Alcinous, right? He's a guest in the house of King Alcinous. And, well, Adam, do you want to take, one of the very first things that caught my attention here was they're going to give Odysseus more gifts, right? Because we've been tracking this theme of guest friendship. Do you want to take this? Because I know you commented on it before we started.
Yeah, and I'm very interested to get, Pavlos, you said you're a political philosophy guy, and so I'm very interested to get your take on this too. Like, I found it very interesting how the king is like, no, let's just give them more gifts. Don't worry about it. We'll tax the people later to cover it. Don't even worry. It's like, man, political philosophy has not really changed all that much in the last, 3,000 years. What were like? I'm curious. Like, did that strike you at all, being a political philosophy guy?
That line did jump out to me as well, and I wanted to know a little bit more about the regime structure of the Phaeacians, right. and how content or discontent the people were with their taxation levels. But to step back from that dynamic, which is somewhat obscure to me, just the relation between the rulers and the ruled in Phaeacia, we get a sort of sense of the royal family and the aristocracy around them. I see King Alcinous's proposal in those opening lines of book 13 as, right, of course, an example of guest friendship, of hospitality, but also, or maybe this is the same thing, a desire to do a noble deed out of a sense of sympathy for Odysseus. He's just finished this long story about his long suffering, and Alcinous even says he references how much Odysseus has suffered in his speech, proposing to all of those men who are present. And so there's a kind of recompense for his suffering that's found in the gifts, and there's also a specific recompense for having gone to Troy and then returning home, or being on the verge of returning home without anything to show for it. That's something that I've become quite interested in book 13, because Odysseus himself is so concerned that he has the gifts and he preserves them and they aren't taken from him over the course of this book, and where to stash them. So it seems that the Phaeacians, there's a kind of responsibility among the great men of Phaeacia to act as good hosts to those who visit them. This is something that actually gets the Phaeacians in trouble later in this book with Poseidon. And also, I think they are the kind of aristocrats who understand satisfaction in life to be bound up with doing good deeds, and that would include generosity. So what do you do once you're an aristocrat, once you're freed from the daily toil of just providing for your own sustenance, your own subsistence farming, or something like that? What do? You have wealth, you have leisure, you have luxury. What do you do with all of that? The satisfying thing to do seems to be to dole out, or to spend, or to lend that material wealth you have in a noble way. And that there's a kind of property or material correspondence in that to doing noble deeds, sort of on the battlefield or something like that. So there isn't an occasion right now to go out and display your courage in battle. There is an occasion right now when this long-suffering noble man has washed on your shores. There is an occasion to act virtuously in the virtue of generosity. And so Alcinous sort of guides everyone to that conclusion. And so the king is setting the example, but also proposing or commanding to those around him that they now act on this virtue that they ought to be interested in acting on. And then they all do it. And so there's a kind of example of, and even command to, the appropriate virtuous action in this context.
Yeah, no, very good. And I think that too, because we've been tracking guest friendship throughout the text, which obviously plays in multiple narratives. With King Alcinous too, it's really interesting, because remember, there was a hesitancy when Odysseus first throws himself right at the knees of the queen. There's almost a hesitancy to welcome him. And we really struggled with that. Maybe not struggled, but we wrestled with that of like, why was there this hesitancy? And I think book 13 might actually show us why. And I think tracking their guest friendship and why they were doing it, I think is incredibly important. And I think it's not only that he's come off of suffering, that even we're going to give gifts, even if we tax the people, but also there seems to be like a deep reciprocity in guest friendship. So it's not only just like the host welcomes them, right? And you see this like really deeply in like, they don't even ask the name, right? You're bathed, you're feasted before you even have to give your name. And Odysseus makes it pretty long actually without his giving his name. But then it switches where there's this reciprocity then where the guest has to tell his story. And Odysseus does such a phenomenal job. He almost steps into the role of the bard, right? He tells such a phenomenal job of the last 4 books of telling this tremendous story that now there's like, okay, now we're going to give you even more gifts. So many more gifts that if I remember right in book 13, it confirms that more than he ever would have brought home from Troy.
That's right.
He's coming like more enriched. And so I think we do need to track that guest friendship because it plays in pretty heavily in book 13 as we kind of watch how this played out. But as we're kind of seeing him transition to leaving King Alcinous' home, one of the things I noticed, I'm not sure how you track this and what to make of it, but he's saying goodbye to his hosts. And so we have, the goodbye to King Alcinous. We have the goodbye to the queen. There's no goodbye to Nausicaa, right? To the princess. We kind of got like a brief like back hall conversation, I think like 2 or 3 books ago, right? Where she kind of just drops the line like, to me, you owe your life. But we talked a lot about Nausicaa being almost a natural temptation, where Calypso was this like almost unnatural temptation of immortality and these types of things. But Nausicaa like is a much more natural temptation, right? To stay on this almost utopian island, to marry this princess, to be grafted into basically this quasi-divine lineage from Poseidon. And she's not here. And that was one thing I noticed, that there was no kind of formal goodbye between them.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that dimension of his relationship with the princess. I will say it's really interesting how we go from the opening books with Calypso and then through this time with the Phaeacians, and somehow Odysseus's desire, his heart's desire, is for rocky Ithaca.
Right.
The perfection, the strange, distorted perfection, superhuman perfection of life with the goddess, life with Calypso, is not going to satisfy him. Is that because he's attached to his family, his country, his wife, his son, his father, and his responsibility there, and the dynamism of the human condition as opposed to the staticness of this life with Calypso? He seems to be, and yet there's also this willingness to suffer. He's not seeking out suffering, but everything he does, it seems like he has to suffer more, and he has to suffer more. He's going to be the long-suffering Odysseus. And so he goes to what seems to be this intermediary realm between the life with the gods and life on Ithaca, which is the Phaeacians, where there's a kind of remoteness from the human condition. They're mortal, but they're somewhat removed from normal human affairs. They have these super fast boats and so on. And the men there, compete in games and so on, but it's not clear that they have the opportunity for war. It's not clear that there's the need for virtue in the political sphere in the full way or in the urgent way that is needed on Ithaca. And so Odysseus is embracing his humanity, his human condition in returning. And that includes Penelope. And Penelope is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. Don't take this the wrong way, but she is wonderful, and we'll see her virtues later in the poem. She's not a goddess, and she's not a young princess anymore. And yet Odysseus loves her and seeks her and returns to her. And so there's a way in which we might want to say life with the goddess, life in Phaeacia, is objectively better than life with Penelope or on Ithaca. And yet it is better, more preferable for Odysseus to return to his own and care for his own and love his own.
No, I think it's very good. I think, too, we're going to see a little bit of that insight with his dialogue with Athena later in the book about why is their relationship so affectionate. And I think that really informs his relationship with Penelope, and even also why the princess Nausicaa was also a temptation to him. Because if you remember, when he basically denies mortality with Calypso, that Odyssean rhetoric kicked into overdrive, but he basically tells her, like, no, listen, you're an immortal goddess, and my wife is simply immortal. She can't compare to you. But then he refers to her, right? I can't remember the exact phrase, the epithet, but refers to her as like, clever Penelope, right? He praises her mind, her intellect, and he doesn't bring the syllogism full circle in Calypso, right? Which is, he's a smart man when he's on the island stuck with the goddess. But I like your question, because that's a question I've been asking, is what is it about Penelope that attracts him? It sometimes seems, does anything attract him about Penelope, right? Does he just want to get home? He talks about Ithaca. Sometimes she's the last person that he mentions. Is she just watching his estate? Remember, that was a big question when he was in the underworld, like, hey, is she still watching my stuff? But then I think the more you go on, there's something about Penelope, and particularly, early on, she's called the matchless queen of cunning. There's something about her intellect that I think is very attractive to him, which is why, again, I think Nausicaa was presented as such a dangerous temptation to him, because she was young, but she was also very witty, right? She had good rhetoric and a good cleverness about him, and they're like back and forth. So no, I think that's a big question. I think it's a question too that will inform as we kind of move on the conversation that he later has with Athena, because there's an affection there too that we have to question, right? Like, why is this such a warm conversation?
Can I give a raw take?
Go ahead.
Can I give I want to give a raw take here, and this is a probably wrong take, but I just like this first time reading it, right? So as I'm going through this, just setting up like what's happened. We just got done with Odysseus telling this grandiose story, this unbelievable story of how he's got here, and these guys are like, holy crap, I can't believe this has happened, right? Like, this is incredible. I can't believe you've made it this far. You're almost home. Don't worry. Let's go party. Let's get together, let's have, drinks and things like that. And like over and over again, it shows him like Odysseus, but I guess this is like around like 30. It's like true, but time and again, Odysseus turned his face toward the radiant sun, anxious for it to set, yearning to go back home. It's like, are you guys so focused on guest friendship that you can't see that this man who has been through absolutely this crazy ride and hasn't been home for 20 years and is so close now, and you guys are the medium in which to get him there, and you're holding him back? I don't know, like, as I was reading this for the first time, I'm like, guys, are you, like, can you not see that? Are you blind to this, or, like, am I missing something? I don't know. That was just kind of a take that I had.
No, that's good. You also have to keep in mind that King Alcinous did offer his daughter in marriage to Odysseus, right? So I'm not sure entirely that he's, are we not seeing some of these things drug out a little bit because, is Odysseus going to maybe make a decision to stay home, right? I mean, he's been made a pretty strong offer, and then they come to even understand who he is, and I think that only adds to his glory, right? His honor. And I'm not entirely sure they're in a huge hurry to bring him home.
Yeah. No. And I'm really struck by the fuller context of Adam's passage around line 30. I think I have a different translation. I have the Cook, but I'll read from my translation. This is the first epic simile of Book 13, and those always seem to be important in Homer. So eager was he to return, as when a man longs for dinner, whose wine-faced oxen have drawn the jointed plow on his fallow land all day. He is glad when the light of the sun goes down on him as he heads for dinner, and his knees fail as he goes. So was Odysseus glad when the sun's light went down. This is very strange. You might expect the simile to work in the following way, that just as Odysseus, just as the farmer wants to rest and have dinner, so Odysseus wanted to have dinner, or something like that. But here, the labor for him is actually maybe not enduring the dinner, the party that they're all having, but wishing for his suffering and his journey to finally be over. And his journey is like the long day of work of the farmer out in the field. And there's also an unfortunate irony here for Odysseus, that he's expecting this night to come and then to end, and then he'll be home, and that will be the end of his suffering. And yet what of course happens is that after this, there is the conversation with Poseidon and the sort of continuation of his suffering and the anticipation of the great task he has to do once he returns to Ithaca. There's more suffering and more strain to come.
Let's look at the journey home. And one of the things that we've been tracking is the motif of sleep. So when Odysseus told his story to King Alcinous and his court, Odysseus had this habit of always falling asleep at key junctures, right?
Yeah.
That then kind of exonerated him from the stupid decisions that his men made. Just off the top of my head, he fell asleep with the bag of winds. He fell asleep when I think his men were going to eat the cattle.
Yeah.
He falls asleep at key junctures. Here we have sleep again, but I think it's presented in a slightly different way, right? And so just wondering what you guys thought about it. Maybe just to throw out some raw ideas. In Fagles, this is 91 or so. Part of it, I think, if I recall correctly, King Alcinous had actually made this promise, right? That not only we're going to bring you home, but it's part of the guest friendship. It's not only will we sail you home, and remember, the king actually promises Odysseus this before he even knows who he is or where home is, right? So this is part of this really enduring guest friendship that I think the Phaeacians are offering. And I think that part of it was you'll be at such rest, right? You'll be at such a rest at this moment that you can literally just sleep the whole way home, and we'll kind of just ferry you home. I think one way to read it is part of that guest friendship. Another way to read it, I think, is it's not entirely clear to me, and I'm happy for pushback here. It's unclear to me how secret the Phaeacians are, right? They kind of have this utopia. They're at the edge of the world. You're right. They have these ships and these automatons, almost this technology. Remember, there's the mechanical dogs that Hephaestus made outside of his court. So this kind of divine, technologically advanced society. I like what you said earlier about it's not really clear how often they go to war or even have guests. They just seem to live in a lot of peace. And so part of me thought that the sleep was also part of a protection of that. That then he doesn't know where, he doesn't actually know how he got back home, right? He couldn't even retrace it, right? So if he actually wanted to go from Ithaca back to the island of the Phaeacians, it's not clear that he could do that. But I wasn't quite sure how secret that is, or how secret the society is. I don't know if anyone can shed light on that.
That sounds right to me. Everything you've just said, Deacon, that there's sleep is a kind of device for the Phaeacians to both be able to discharge the great expression of guest friendship they have, not just in hosting, but this special additional version that the Phaeacians are capable of transporting someone anywhere you want. We'll take you home, and we can do that, and yet do that in a way while preserving their secrecy. I think that's right. There's something isolated and almost superhuman about the Phaeacian realm. The other thing that I thought that I detected in this, when Odysseus boards the ship, this is in the 70s, line 70s in book 13, it almost sounds like he's going to his funeral, or it's a funeral ship or something like that. Is even a reference to death. So Homer writes that they spread out a blanket and linen cloth for Odysseus on the deck of the hollow ship, so that he might sleep without waking upon the stern. He himself boarded too and lay down in silence. He's not even talking as they're doing this, so he's a sort of mute person entering and then lying down. Each of them sat down at oarlocks in order. They loosed the cable from the pure stone as soon as they leaned on the oars and flung up salt water with the blade. For him, there fell down upon his eyelids a balmy sleep, unwaking, most sweet, nearest in semblance to death. And so there's a kind of solemnity to the whole affair that makes me think about the gravity of a funeral. And there's a kind of silence to the whole affair. And then it's even directly compared to sleep. So I don't know what to make of that, other than he's crossing from a semi-human realm to the more fully human realm. And it seems like sleep resembling death would be appropriate for that. And then certainly I think it might be part of their operational security of the Phaeacians that they sort of guard the secret of their location and the voyage to and from there.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, Fagles has an irresistible sleep fell deeply on his eyes, the sweetest, soundest oblivion, still as the sleep of death itself. Yeah, I did not pick up on that, but I really like you illuminating that. because I know in reading it, we have a Sunday Great Books group that we have, and we're reading through this too. And some of the guys have been very eager on these type of transitions like that to draw it back to his journey to the underworld, right? That he's journeyed down to death and somehow, done that hero's journey of journeying down into death and to coming back up. And so some of them are very sensitive then to seeing little microcosms of that. And so it's interesting to me that you could kind of paint that there's almost a death scene here as he goes from the Phaeacians back to maybe the more mortal realm, if you want to call it, the more normal realm, at least, of Ithaca.
Yeah, and if we keep in mind Achilles and the interesting contrasts between Achilles and Odysseus and the epics that belong to each of them, Achilles ultimately accepts death, a young death, an early death, along with a short life of glory, as his way of strangely achieving immortality, despite the fact that he was denied the immortality of being born of a god and a goddess. And then Odysseus seems to be the man who is returning from the temptation to eternal life, which is in this universe strangely a kind of unliving life, and returning to human life and the human realm and the human dynamic. And in that, again, there's this transition from life to death. And so the fact that he himself descends to Hades, is capable of that, and is capable of returning. He's capable of returning from the island of Calypso, a kind of counterfeit Ithaca or counterfeit domestic realm, to the real thing, the real human realm. And that has to at least be compared to death, or the transition between life and death.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. Maybe just to round this thought off, what do we make of the fact that they didn't even wake him up when they arrived to Ithaca? This is something I found very bizarre the first time I read it, and it still sat with me oddly on this read through as well. This is that line in Fagles, it's like 135 or so, that they laid him down on the sand to sleep, still dead to the world. They don't even wake him up when they're there, right? And that I had a harder time interpreting that according to guest friendship or according to like the secrecy of the island, because it doesn't seem to afford either one. And then it kind of leaves him in a bind, right? It's I mean, given his history, it makes sense why he wakes up and immediately thinks he's been tricked and that he's going to face some new hellhole on some unknown island somewhere. And so what do we make of like their intent of not waking him up and laying him asleep on the beach?
I don't know. On my end, I thought it was very weird too, and I was imagining them like how inconvenient it was just to even move dead weight like that for like off the ships.
I don't know what to make of that. Quite simply, it's very brief. They lie him down, and then it just briefly says, "Then they started back homeward," and then we transition to a conversation between Poseidon.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. And also just kind of like laying all his treasure out on the beach. Like, wouldn't you be kind of worried that like someone's going to come by and take it? Like, it's just odd. I don't know. I haven't been able to kind of like really integrate it into what I feel like I felt pretty good about why he sleeps on the ship, but I wasn't able to really integrate that into this, unless it's just, again, another motif of him, waking up and wondering what island. He actually later, not to jump too ahead, but he repeats a line that he's repeated before. When he actually wakes up, he says, where have I landed? Where are they here? Violent, savage, lawless, which is something he says very similarly to the Cyclops narrative. Another thing that I'd love everyone's opinion on is this issue of the cave. So before Homer tells us about him being laid down to sleep, around line 120 or so, we get the description of this cave that's on the beach. And just like in short, the cave has two ways in, one facing the north wind, a pathway down for mortals. The other facing a south, belongs to the gods. No man may go that way. It is the path for all the deathless powers. So we're introduced to this cave that's on the beach. It has two entrances, one for mortals, the other one for immortals. And the reason that I kind of flag it is that Homer gives us these details. I tend to have a strong read of Homer the teacher, which Homer the teacher doesn't give a whole lot of unnecessary details, right? I tend to approach it that there's some intentionality for what he's offering us. And I know we're kind of skipping things, but just to kind of just weave this cave narrative together just for a second, is we're introduced to the cave with two entrances. Then we see that after Odysseus finds Athena, and Athena is going to help him and etc. She helps him to, this is like line 410 or so, she helps him to put his treasure in the cave. But it doesn't tell us, it's not overly clear what entrances they use, right? So it is clear, at least from my read, that both Athena and Odysseus enter the cave, right? Athena comes in and finds a place for the treasure, and Odysseus is bringing the treasure in. And then Athena seals the cave. But it's also not told us what entrance she seals. So I didn't know. I mean, I had a lot of questions when I read this. I'm not sure if anyone can bring anything dispositive to the table. We talked about this in our small group as well. And the best someone brought was someone was familiar with some Neoplatonic gloss later on of trying to read this as a precursor to Plato's cave. But I don't know, any thoughts on this cave, and if it's saying anything about, I mean, the temptation here is that it's saying something again about Odysseus and his closeness to immortality and closeness to the gods, that he's kind of going in and out of this cave of the nymphs, and it's not entirely clear what entrance he's using with Athena, right? Is he afforded to use the entrance of the gods? Is he not? Like, is there a subtle commentary on who Odysseus is or who he's become? Any thoughts on the cave?
So I want to answer the question about the cave in relation to a question I have about the treasure itself. What's the big deal with the treasure? Why shouldn't he just be concerned about where he is, about being home, and shouldn't being home be enough? The way I've begun to think about this is that Odysseus is anxious for the treasure, that he has these gifts, these goods from the Phaeacians, perhaps for two reasons. One, for its own sake, that there's a kind of reward for virtue or recompense for suffering, or bond to those who hosted him that gives this a kind of sentimental value or a kind of import to itself, that in doing great deeds, it's natural and proper to acquire or receive great things, having done great deeds. And so it's not just an expression of greed for material goods or something like that, but there might be a greater depth to it, that once one has acquired the virtues and has exercised them in battle, in warfare, in voyages, all of that would be incomplete if you had nothing material to show for it, even if the material goods are not the end for which you did all of these things. That's one. Another is really the utility of the wealth itself, which is how is Odysseus going to use this wealth once he is back in Ithaca and once he is restored to the kingship? The suitors have been destroying his substance, destroying his household, eating, sort of picking the household clean of its wealth, draining its resources for years at this point. And so Odysseus might be thinking of his own vocation as father, husband, and king in wanting to have these gifts, wanting to have this loot that should have been from Troy, but it wasn't, and then it's actually exceeded that. He's gone through this great voyage, and he's earned even more than he would have if he had just sacked Troy and returned with the goods. And so there's a kind of usefulness, perhaps, to these material goods, that he could restore his household to its proper splendor and its proper wealth once he has returned to the kingship. Now, what does that have to do with the cave, besides a cave being a good hiding place? My thought is that Odysseus is not simply leaving behind the immortal, despite what I said a few minutes ago. He is going back to Ithaca, and that is where he is going to perform or continue to perform godlike deeds. And so what is the aristeia, right? Sort of the expression of one's virtue on the battlefield in the Iliad. What is Odysseus's great aristeia? his great exhibition of his arete, of his virtue? Well, part of it is certainly in going through all of the adventures that were recounted in the last few books. Part of it is, again, becoming the poet and retelling those. That seems like a great act, a great deed, a great expression of his cleverness and wit and rhetoric and ability. But another part of it is what is to come in the remainder of the Odyssey, which is his own reconquest of Ithaca in a typically Odyssean fashion, which is going to involve all kinds of cleverness and deception and so on. And so in so doing, he is actually achieving a kind of divinity. He's earning the title of being a godlike hero. And so that cave might signify the fact that, yes, he's returning to the human realm from the Phaeacians and from Calypso's offer, but he is still bearing the kind of quasi-divine nature of a hero in so doing.
Yeah, I like that. I do think, there seems to be this deep connection, right, between the lute as basically physical signs of, like tangible signs of one's glory, right? Because that's what I saw with King Alcinous, is that it's almost unfitting that we do not send this man home with all these glorious treasures as a reflection, as an analog of his own soul, of his own, arete, right? Which I think that Homer is kind of challenging his audience on, what that arete is, right? Because we have this kind of deeply clever intellectual thing. We're kind of used to seeing this more as like a military prowess with Achilles, and now we're kind of seeing it more as this like very intellectually clever man. And we get Athena right there, right? This is perfect, because Athena feels this really close friendship with Odysseus because she sees in him the sort of mortal equivalent to her divine cleverness. And so yes, it's that notion of heroic, godlike heroism includes not only battlefield prowess, but also speech and playfulness with speech, and even deception and plotting. She keeps being referred to as clever in forming plans, and so is Odysseus. But yes, there's something fitting about a physical representation of the greatness of the one whom you are honoring. And with Alcinous and the Phaeacians and Odysseus, that is, we need to honor this man's virtue. I can't help but think of religious versions of this for ourselves as Catholics, that is it sufficient to worship God wherever you are in any circumstances? Of course. But if you have the ability to, should you adorn the place of worship? Of course, it is fitting to sort of give your wealth and decorate and augment the place of worship in a way that reflects in a very visible and tangible way the great, even if in an insufficient way, the greatness of the one whom you are worshiping there. I see an analog there too to the spiritual life, right? That are in the Christian life, of the pursuit of arete, the pursuit of virtue, of configuring ourselves to Christ. Actually, we're told is storing your treasure in heaven, right? That there actually is a reward. There is actually a glory and an honor attached to this, right? It's not sometimes we pick up Kant, I think, a bit too much in Christian circles.
Yeah.
And it's I do this selfless act of selfless love for no reason whatsoever. Well, the divine economy says that actually you're storing up treasure in heaven, right? So this does seem to be, I love Homer because I think in Homer, as you kind of mentioned earlier, just understanding Western culture, we see a lot of these things in Homer in a very nascent way, right? We're starting to see, I think, some of these grand conversations and perennial insights into who man is, and even his spiritual life and his soul. Let's go back to, he's laid on the beach asleep, and Homer transitions the narrative then into Poseidon. And I think this is important. This is another thing that when I first read, and I'm still not sure I'm settled on it, I found very odd. So basically, let me just set up the facts here pretty quick. The basic fact pattern is that Poseidon feels like he's been slighted by the Phaeacians, right? By them taking Odysseus home. And this is kind of interesting too, because they're actually descendants from Poseidon, right? They have a close proximity to him. So he goes to Zeus, and my read of this is, it's like 170 or so, that Poseidon basically says, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to crush the ship, right? So the ship that brought, I'm going to crush them. And two, I'm going to pile a huge mountain around their port. So this basically seafaring people are going to be, locked out, right? Or they're at least be greatly hampered in their ability to sail around the known world as they seem to be doing. Zeus's response, I think, is intriguing. One, what he doesn't do is what intrigues me the most. Zeus is over guest friendship. Zeus is the one who is most, akin to the host and the guest and watching over them, right? When Menelaus battles Paris in the Iliad, he calls out to Zeus that, Zeus, you have to let me defeat Paris because you have to show everyone what happens to a guest that violates guest friendship, right? Mm-hmm. So Zeus has played this role. Excuse me. He's played this role, and here there's almost something unjust, right? That the Phaeacians have been ferrying people back and forth. We're told here in a minute that there's a prophecy. I think King Alcinous has already said this actually in a previous book, that there's this prophecy that at some point Poseidon would get angry with them about this, which I think is another thing to unpack. But it's interesting to me here that Zeus doesn't step in and protect the Phaeacians as hosts. Now, I think, and I could be wrong here, I think that Zeus does something clever, though, where he basically tells Poseidon, like, hey, they're in your power. Do it. Oh, wait. And he says Zeus had second thoughts, which is a fascinating phrase just to begin with, right? So Zeus has second thoughts, and he says, basically, hey, why don't you crush the ship where the Phaeacians can see it happen? And Poseidon's like, that sounds great. I'll do that. And at first glance, it doesn't seem that Zeus has ran a whole lot of interference there. Yeah. But then the more I kind of sat with it, the more I realized that what that does is it allows the Phaeacians to beg for mercy, right? So if the ship is destroyed outside of their purview, then they don't understand what's happening, and Poseidon will just come in and drop the mountain on the port. But because King Alcinous and the people can watch the ship be destroyed by Poseidon, then they realize that this prophecy is coming true, right? And this is kind of what happens, is that you have this almost like Nineveh moment, right? Where King Alcinous then is like, oh no, the prophecy, my father, excuse me, my father said this, like, quick, let's make sacrifices to Poseidon and maybe he'll have mercy. So it seems like Zeus's suggestion actually did afford them something, that it opened the door for possible mercy on behalf of Poseidon. I'm not sure. I mean, any thoughts on this or any reads on this?
I think that's a wonderful way of explaining what's going on here with Zeus's intervention. He is brilliant in this move, and I guess the thing I want to address is whether it is just, whether Poseidon has any justice in his action of wanting to destroy the ship and then enclose the port, and it seems like Zeus has created the space for that mercy as you discussed. But I wonder why wouldn't he simply restrain Poseidon if this is unjust? Perhaps it's not simply unjust. Why wouldn't it be simply unjust? Is the kind of extraordinary guest friendship and hospitality which the Phaeacians are capable of offering, is that a bit too godlike? Is there something even beyond? I mean, it seems like one of the wonderful things about being a proper host is that you get to act in a godlike manner in the best possible sense towards your guests, and that's wonderful. But perhaps the Phaeacians are able to take it so far that they are in a kind of near occasion of pride or something like that, that they're able to not just offer this wonderful hospitality in their home, but ferry people anywhere they want with great rapidity. There's a kind of Tower of Babel tendency here with their technology, with their self-sufficiency. And so they're reminded by Poseidon crushing the ship of the limitations that are placed on them. And those limitations have been expressed through the prophecy that Alcinous is aware of through his own family. And so they need to, in a way, be reminded. Perhaps they need to be reminded that they are still mortal, that they are still limited in some way, lest they actually begin to exercise their powers in genuinely unjust ways.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't think more about that. The other thing that occurs to me too is that, let's go back to King Alcinous being hesitant to welcome Odysseus, right? Or at least I would read it as a hesitancy, right? He comes in, he falls at the knees of the queen. The queen in that role still also doesn't really play the intercessor role. If you remember, she doesn't actually say anything right? We kind of were led that she was going to say something, and later in the book, she does play that role. She does serve as an intercessor, but she doesn't really say anything. And then it's like, I forgot his name, but it's like the old lord that finally like stands up and is basically like, King Alcinous, what are you doing? Guys over there wallowing in the ashes, like do something. You know, when I first read that, we kind of discussed on the podcast, there were a lot of thoughts thrown out of like, you know, maybe they understand guest friendship, but it's kind of theoretical to them because how often do they get guests where they are, right? They kind of seem very insular. They're even when Odysseus was walking to the palace, right? He's kind of hidden by Athena because the people are skeptical of strangers. I think that's all valid, but now I kind of have a different view with a stronger understanding of the prophecy of like, you know, does he not realize that, is King Alcinous maybe not hesitant because he realizes like, oh, wait, here's another person that if I welcome, I'm in danger now of triggering the prophecy. And in that way, it's almost a grand nobility that they're willing to continually help the stranger, help Odysseus, help the guest, this like participate in guest friendship, even at the risk of this kind of societal punishment.
This is the beauty of being able to have a conversation with other guys, because that is not what I picked up on. But that's awesome.
Yeah, and I'll just note, it seems like this is the grand finale of the Phaeacian escort service, right? Escorting people home. That Alcinous says, we must give up escorting mortals when anyone comes to our city. Let us sacrifice to Poseidon to sort of assuage him. And they do. And so there's a kind of great status given to Odysseus as being the last mortal to ever be escorted by the Phaeacians. There's a kind of accomplishment in itself there.
I like that. It's interesting too, the juxtaposition. So Homer leaves the narrative open, right? So we're not really told whether Poseidon accepts these prayers.
That's right.
And then it immediately transitions to, and at that moment, they're begging Poseidon for mercy, Odysseus awakes. And Homer very clearly juxtaposes these two things. So let's look a little bit about Odysseus waking up. So he wakes up on the beach. He's afraid that he's been hoodwinked. He has that line. It's like a little bit before 2:30 in Fagles. You know, what are they here? You know, violent, savage, lawless. I read that probably maybe a bit too thickly, because I see a grand parallel between the Cyclops narrative and Odysseus and the suitors, right? I think that's like the cleverness and the irony of the curse of the Cyclops, right? Is that, and what's going to happen is Odysseus is going to play the Cyclops role, right? Odysseus is going to come in and find the guests that are in his home that are in violation of guest friendship, in a certain way will consume them, right? Because I think that, and is in right, as we'll see as the poem goes on, right, seems to be in his right to do so. Even in book 13, Athena sits down to plot the death of the suitors. So clearly, under the rules of guest friendship, the guests here are in violation of that friendship and have been condemned to die. And so, and I see that, that Odysseus in the cave of the Cyclops also was abusive of guest friendship, right? Not only were they there to steal, but then he holds his men back by, wait, maybe we can get gifts out of this guy too, which seems to be an abuse of guest friendship and seems to be very analogous to what the suitors are doing to him. So I read this line very thickly, because when he says this, like, what are they, violent, savage, lawless? I feel like Homer's very intentionally trying to bring us back to the Cyclops narrative to think about these two in parallel.
I guess this is pointing back to those earlier books and forward. What did Odysseus learn? What did he learn from the encounter with the Cyclops? Was that whole series of encounters with monsters and other kinds of beings and creatures and men of various kinds in his voyages, was that a kind of education? Was that a necessary preparation for what he's going to do when he returns, in order to reconquer and reclaim Ithaca, in order to rule well, in order to be the father and the son and the husband that he is? The opening, the proeme to the entire poem, speaks of how Odysseus, this man of many turns, saw the cities of many men and knew their thought or knew their mind. And then on the ocean, he suffered many pains within his heart, striving for his life and his companion's return, striving for his own soul. And so he does a kind of tour of various minds of men or other creatures. I wonder what he gets from the Cyclops, and it seems like on the one hand there's this kind of lesson of don't be overconfident and shout your name and so on. But you might be suggesting, Deacon, that there's almost a lesson in savagery or something like that he has to play the part of the Cyclops, if not savagery, at least of proper vengeance meted out to the suitors. That if he understands the justice of the Cyclops in repelling the invaders to his cave, he will be able to act more fully on the justice that he needs to act upon when he's returned to Ithaca. I'm not sure. That's intriguing to me.
Well, I think there is, I mean, not to get too far ahead, but then when we get to the suitors and we kind of get that zenith of the poem of him actually engaging them, it is an incredibly brutal scene.
It is.
And it's one that's almost completely devoid of mercy, right?
Yes.
Outside of like one or two things, even for like I mean, I think most people are shocked.
Yeah.
The servants. I think the servants are one that, I have this little graphic novel of the Odyssey that I let my eldest read. It's actually really good. It tracks the poem really well. The Iliad one's really good. The Odyssey one needs a little bit of censoring. The artist got a little too excited about Calypso and a few other scenes.
Okay.
But then, it's really, even that one kind of hints at the end about what happens to the servants. And my child was like, wait, what's happening? Because you kind of see them like lined up in the back. She's like, what's happening back there? I'm like, well, it's a kind of a merciless deal here. So I don't know. I don't mean to devoid Odysseus of like, I think some of the more positive themes of coming home and place and things like this. But I do think I read a deep parallel between what happened with the Cyclops and then with him having to come home. That I think there's a lot of imagery there. And I think that's kind of the deep irony of the curse against him. Because I even think, and I'd have to line it up on like the timelines, that even the curse of the Cyclops is not just, because it has a caveat, right? Like that he doesn't make it home. But if he does make it home, make sure it's full of pain and blah, 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 blah. But then the last line also then talks about then what he will find at home, that he will then find a world of pain. It's interesting to say, like, what actually precipitates the problem of the suitors?
Oh, yeah. It's only been 3 years, I think. I think the suitors have only been there 3 years. So you might be right. I'd have to check that timeline as well. But you're suggesting maybe the curse of the Cyclops causes the plague of the suitors to descend on the home.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to see the timeline, or at least it causes it by degree. Because I think sometimes we see that by degree, because sometimes, assuming you think he has a real choice about his men not eating the cattle of the sun, part of that, right, is that you'll find a world of pain when you get home. Well, he's already going to find a world of pain when he's got home because of the Cyclops narrative. So the question is, like, on some of these, are they changing things not by kind, but by degree? Right. So would his pain at home be less if he would have shown up with a ship of his own men versus showing up by himself? Right. Yeah. So sometimes it's been interesting to me on this read through to kind of track, like, what is it that actually precipitates all these different difficulties in his life? Right.
Yeah. Another comment along similar lines. What you're drawing our attention to is the fact that Odysseus is a son, a husband, and a father, but he's also a ruler, right? The sort of the exercise of violence in order to restore proper order, that kind of prerogative belongs to a political authority. It does not belong simply to any old person on the street, except maybe in certain extreme conditions. But if we're thinking about how the Homeric poems anticipate all of these developments in the Western tradition, there's a lot of sort of anticipation of political philosophy here in that he is a private man, but he's also a public man. He's also a king, and he also has a kind of vocation to restore just order and a just regime on his island, in his island kingdom. Mm-hmm. And that's going to involve a great deal of violence, unfortunately, given how disordered it has become in his absence.
It is. And I mean, to not the suitors' credit, but not to be overly empathetic to them, I mean, they have like 9 prophecies that things are going to turn out terribly for you, right? And they laugh them all off. It's not like they're just completely blindsided by this deal. Okay, so let's look at Athena. So, he's here on the beach. He doesn't know where he is. Athena comes to him basically in the guise of a shepherd boy. And in this guise, she tells him that this is Ithaca. And so we see this like very Odyssean moment in which he chokes back. This is like a little bit before 290. He chokes back, what his heart feels about knowing the truth that he's on Ithaca, right? It says he always invokes the cunning in his heart. And so he's hiding what he really feels inside. And then on this kind of like Odyssean mask, here comes this long background narrative of like who he is. And he's just spinning this tale. And you almost get the sense then of Athena, that Athena just finds this incredibly charming, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
I really like what you said earlier, where you taught, I won't be able to phrase it exactly the same way, but you mentioned that Athena basically, or Odysseus is basically a reflection of Athena back to herself, right? When I was reading this in my notes, I said that Odysseus is almost part of Athena's self-love, right? Because she really, there's a lot of really warm language in this. So at the end of his, he's sitting here spinning this tale, and this is almost like a parent listening to a kid that, like, you're lying, I know this. And then there's all this warm imagery, right? She breaks into a smile. She stroked him with her hand and then appears, right, as a beautiful, tall woman. And then has all these deeply empathetic statements, right? Like we're both old hands at the art of intrigue, right? And then she tells him, like, basically we get into this narrative of, do you realize how much I've helped you? Do you realize how much I've been there for you? And, when did you see this? And when did you not? And they're kind of going back and forth. And again, like a little after 370, Athena is speaking to him and her glances, flashing warmly, right? Saying, you are so winning, so worldly wise, so self-possessed. And I just, one, I find this to be an incredibly warm, almost affectionate narrative between a mortal and an immortal. One that doesn't have any component of sexuality to it at all, right? This isn't like Odysseus and Calypso. And I do think that, as we kind of mentioned earlier, I think that Odysseus is kind of brought into her self-love, right? She's a reflection, or he's a reflection of her, right, in kind of mortal form. And she just kind of delights in him.
Yeah, a friend is another self. It has to be another. It can't be yourself entirely, but it also has to be like you in some way, the friend. Or there's a kind of resonance when you see something of yourself, something that corresponds to yourself closely in another. And so she says, you are by far the best of mortals in plans and stories, and I among all the gods am famed for planning and shrewdness. Right? We're kindred spirits. And then it's interesting that comes right before her saying that I contributed so much to your survival and your flourishing, right? That maybe that's a way of her both welcoming him and encouraging him and delighting in him, but also reminding him that you're not entirely self-sufficient. You're great insofar as you are like me. In your resemblance to me, you are great. And I was there to aid you. And now let us sit down and hold counsel together as peers, but I'm still a goddess. And as peers, we are going to plot your just revenge against the suitors.
Yeah, I just find this to be such a unique moment in mythology. I don't know. I mean, granted, obviously, my understanding is somewhat truncated. I'm not an expert on Greek mythology, but this just seems to be an incredibly unique interaction between a mortal and an immortal, right? To have this kind of level of reflection. And I think it really is. I think this too speaks to what we've already mentioned of, Athena loves Odysseus. I mean, to use that language, which I don't think is too much of a stretch, because he reflects her back to herself, right? But mainly because of his mind, right? His intrigue, his cleverness, his wit. And it's just really intriguing to me then that Odysseus basically turns around and loves Penelope basically for the same reason.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this is at least my read of their relationship, that why Penelope is loved is because she is that matchless queen of cunning. And so in a certain way, right? Her nous, her intellect, is like Odysseus's. And it's something that he finds unique in her that makes her unique, even when compared to a goddess like Calypso.
And there is that kind of, from the beginning of the Odyssey, there's that emphasis on the mind, and really throughout the Odyssey in the character of Odysseus. And it's not to the exclusion of warrior prowess. And I would also say that conversely, Achilles is not just a jock without a head on top, right? But certainly the emphasis for Odysseus is more on the mind, and so that kind of love that he's able to have towards Athena, and then also the marital love he's able to have with Penelope has to be intellectual on some level as well. It has to be clever and cunning and prudent, and have that kind of that kind of wisdom for them to really be peers, for them really to be complements to one another.
How much of this do you think is Homer the teacher pushing into his audience of what does it actually mean to be virtuous, or what does it mean to have arete? Because when I read the Iliad, I found it very clear, at least from my read, that Homer was offering Hector as a foil to Achilles, right? That Achilles, if arete is simply excellence in combat, and that's what it means to be an excellent man, then, no one stands up to Achilles. But then Hector is presented as such a full contrast, right? He goes back, he has piety towards the gods, he has piety towards his parents, he's called back to Troy to offer the sacrifice. We have this incredibly warm moment when he goes back and sees his family, but he also kind of declines the temptation of his wife. And so we see that he has his piety kind of in a proper hierarchical order. He's just offered as such a foil against Odysseus, who's then just raging at the slightest slight against him. And then Odysseus, we don't have, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, we don't have all the interim narratives. We've talked about them on the podcast, though, because I think the interim narratives then do really contrast. After Hector's death, the contrast seems to become Odysseus and Achilles. Which one takes down Troy, right? The military prowess or the cleverness and wit? And it ends up being the cleverness and wit. And we see that with, I guess you could confirm that narrative with the narrative of Achilles' armor being given to Odysseus and not Ajax. And so, how much of this then, here towards the end of the Odyssey, I guess not the end, but I mean, I feel like we're towards the end because he's back on Ithaca. Here we just get this really affectionate conversation between Odysseus and a goddess that's almost completely predicated upon cleverness and intrigue, right? That he survives when all others don't. I think it's not only compared to Achilles, which we saw explicitly, I think, in the underworld, but then even in this book, I think it's compared explicitly, this is 435 or so, to Agamemnon, right? Who had this glory, this kleos, this he had the conquering of Troy, but then the coming home narrative, he's destroyed, right? He comes home in a somewhat arrogant fashion, and is then undone by his wife and her lover. And so, how much of this do you think we can read into this? This is Homer, the teacher, really pushing for a superiority of the intellect, and not in a way that, like you mentioned, not to the exclusion of being spirited. Odysseus is definitely spirited. Right? We talk about, even when the bag of winds, right? He almost threw himself overboard and committed suicide, right? But his spirit will not allow him to not endure, right? He is hated by the gods, or whatever his name means, right? The one that will suffer. But his spirit is enduring. He's definitely spirited, and he's definitely a great warrior. We saw some of that in the Iliad. I mean, he can hold his own. But the intellect seems to be praised so much here.
Yeah. A couple of brief comments. I might have a somewhat more sympathetic view of Achilles than you do, without denying the contrast you've drawn with Hector.
Probably wouldn't be hard.
Well, I'll say, I guess if we think about the theme of immortality in the Iliad and the Odyssey, we might see a different contrast than the one that you laid out very well between Hector and Achilles. And that might be between Achilles and Odysseus on the theme of immortality. And so if Achilles is enraged at being deprived of the visible sign of honor, that he in fact is the greatest of the Achaeans, and yet he is not the ruler. More profoundly, Achilles, he has the existential rage at the fact that he is a mortal instead of an immortal. And why should he in particular be enraged at that? Well, because there was a prophecy that the son of Thetis would be greater than his father. And so Thetis was supposed to be married to Zeus and have a son with Zeus, or at least have a son with Zeus. And so that was avoided by marrying off Thetis or coupling Thetis with a mortal. And so Achilles is the man who is a mortal or half god, but is supposed to be not just any old god, but even greater than Zeus. And so he is acutely aware of the fact that he had a kind of destiny for something even greater than the human condition, and it was denied to him. In that respect, he's unique among human beings, but he's also, I think, a kind of emblem for the entire human condition. If we think about, again, Homer is anticipating the whole Western tradition. We're mortal, but we're not simply mortal, right? We're human, but we have something that's divine in us. We have bodies, but we also have an eternal soul, right? All of that seems packed into Achilles, and he's a very specific version, manifestation of that tension. But there's a way in which our human condition itself plays that out and lives that out. And so Odysseus has his own way of navigating the contrast between mortality and immortality, and between the divine and the gods, or the divine and the human. And the last thing I'll say is that I think you're onto something with this kind of shift towards the intelligent and towards intelligence. And I'll just add, in addition to Agamemnon suffering in his homecoming, suffering betrayal and death in his homecoming, if we go to one of the great statements of that story, Aeschylus's Oresteia, we have 3 plays beginning with the one that recounts Agamemnon's death. But by the end of that, you have Athena intervening in Athenian politics or Athenian society in order to establish jury trials for the first time, and sort of delegating authority to man, almost in the way that God delegates authority to man through Moses after the flood, that we're going to sort of set up some way of dealing with the problem of murder that we hadn't had a structure for with Cain and Abel. And so there's a kind of shift from other gods to Athena, and from more generally just divine rule simply to human agency. And that seems anticipated here in this much earlier work of Homer's. What Aeschylus shows centuries later seems anticipated here in the prominence of Odysseus and Athena as his pair, as his corresponding goddess.
I like that. So kind of going back to your more positive read, I guess, of Achilles, what do you make, though, of, I know you touched on this to a certain degree, but what do you make, though, of like Achilles, when Homer puts him in the underworld and puts into his mouth, I would rather go be a dirt farmer, than down here where I am right now. That seems to really run contrary to the decision that he made in the Iliad, right? That he's giving a commentary that, his decision to stay and win immortal fame in Troy instead of going back and having a family, but losing that type of immortality, that he's now realizing that he didn't make the better choice, that he would rather, be alive even as a dirt farmer. And then even in that, the other thing that caught my attention, and Agamemnon does this too, he's very then concerned about his son. That's what he wants to know about. Like, what is my son like? Which is interesting, because that seems to be a concern, like the sonship and fatherhood, that would have been much more akin if he would have gone back from Troy and had a family, right, and lived his days in peace. So it's interesting, like when I read that as that Achilles has chosen poorly. Now, I don't think that means that I don't think it's a confirmation that Odysseus has chosen correctly, if that makes sense, right? Because I don't think there's anything in there that shows that he wants to live this more life of the mind. But it seems like in that narrative, as I read it, that Achilles is somewhat, not repentant, but somewhat has buyer's remorse on the decision to pursue immortality that he did. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I've heard the Iliad described as the tragic epic and the Odyssey as the comic epic, and that roughly makes sense to me. And here, I guess I would say that there's this kind of tragic condition that man finds himself in, as exemplified by Achilles in the Iliad and Odyssey. And while there's this comic character to Odysseus, he's right. Comedy is concerned with lower characters, not the noble, and sort of being crafty and sort of getting away, and also a happy conclusion. And there's all of that in the Odyssey. Still, the pagan Greek epic seems to me more primarily to have a tragic vision. And I would just point to the fact that at the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus has this great victory, and yet we know he's going to start wandering again. He's going to be called again. His destiny is to continue wandering, and there's this kind of restlessness in Odysseus as there is in Achilles in the underworld. And so I guess stepping back from Homer himself, I would comment that yes, with what Homer saw and with what he knew, there was a much more tragic vision of the cosmos and the human condition than we have as Christians, and then Revelation reveals to us as being possible. Christianity seems to have a fundamentally comedic view of the human condition and the cosmos. And the Greeks, including Homer, seem much more tragic in their fundamental disposition. So there's going to be something unsatisfying at the end. There's going to be something incomplete at the end, no matter how well you choose, whether it's Achilles or Odysseus.
Yeah, no, I think that's very much true. Well, very good. Any other thoughts on book 13?
So I just want to point out really quick, so just to backtrack just for a minute. So Odysseus gets put on Ithaca. He plays it so well with Athena, and basically makes up a complete story on the spot. It warms the heart of Athena. She's really proud of him. But then Odysseus says something like, where have you been? Look at all these things that have been happening. Like it's hard for me to see a goddess. It's hard for men to see goddesses as they truly are. Where have you been? And then it seems like that she almost says something like she trusted him enough to not get in the way of the plan in which she was trying to unfold. And when that happens, that's when she scatters this mist, and it shows that he has this true human moment to where the point of Odysseus is so thrilled to see Ithaca that he kisses the green earth, he kisses the dirt. He's so excited to see it. It's a true, I think, human moment. And the reality sets in that Odysseus realizes that he could have ended up like King Agamemnon. It very easily could have been. I think this is around 440 or so, where he's talking about he could have easily died just like Agamemnon did, the fate of Agamemnon. And so I don't know. I saw, again, this is the first time read, so I didn't catch all the things that you guys have been talking about for the last 30 minutes or whatever. But but it was fascinating to hear you guys talk about it. But I just found it to be a truly human moment for Odysseus here, and a little bit of a humility aspect to it. I do think it's interesting at the very end of the book that Odysseus asks, and this is, I don't know, around 475 or so. He says why not tell him the truth? You know it all. Or is he too, like father, like son, condemned to hardship, roving the barren salt sea while strangers devour our livelihood out here? So he's asking, about I'm assuming about a son, right? With Menelaus, why didn't you tell him about it? And she didn't really give an answer. If you notice, 380, that was really smooth of her, because she really didn't answer the question. She was just basically no need to be upset. Don't worry about it. No anguish there. Just trust me. He's fine. I'll escort him back. And then at the very end, I just love the image of, and I guess we'll find out more about it in book 14, but I love the image of the loyal swineherd. Go talk to this guy who's, been faithful to you this whole time. I don't know, again, there are two like very human moments at the very end of this book that really resonated with me quite a bit.
I love how you tied those together. It seems like kissing the earth and then acknowledging that he could have had the fate of Agamemnon and needs the help of Athena. Both of those are sort of Odysseus in the posture of humility, of lacking self-sufficiency, and for all of his strength, for all of his virtue, recognizing he needs help and he is dependent upon the goddess. And then at the very end there, with the turn to the swineherd, he's described as a friend. He's a friend to your son and to Penelope. And so we go from Odysseus having a friendship with a goddess to then there's also this low servant who is a friend, a loyal friend to your family, to the queen and to the prince. And so there's this wonderful tying together of the high and the low and different senses of friendship.
Professor, we really appreciate you being here today and helping us through book 13. And next week, we'll be looking at book 14, in which we are introduced to the loyal swineherd, which is one of my favorite characters in all of the Odyssey. So, but again, Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see you guys next week.